Hey everybody, Jeff here. Today I'm going to show you how I took off and reinstalled a new 2014 Range Rover Evoque turbo exhaust manifold. Now I didn't just do this for fun, and I'm not a certified mechanic. I just wanted to get rid of this really annoying rattle I had, which turned out to be from my wastegate. Really sounded like tin cans or a really heavy lifter under boost. Not all the time, just when you hit about peak boost. It would tick around, sounded like cans rattling in the engine. Really annoying. Turns out I had a significant leak that I'll show you later on between the exhaust manifold and the gasket. So all in all, I'm super happy with the results. I'm showing you the end before we talk about how I did it, so we're going a little Tarantino. The whole project cost me about $300 on a trip to the store. I did have to obviously take off the exhaust manifold and the primary exhaust pipe, or the downpipe, to take care of this job, and I did it all from the top side of the engine. So you're going to be on top of the engine with a pad on your knees. I'll show you later, but I'm super happy with the results. Most of the tools I used were 10mm sockets and extensions, and 13mm sockets and extensions. If you have a big variety of all of those, my guess is you're probably going to use all of them. There's not a lot of space back there, so any little bit in your tooling will totally help you with this job. You will get dirty. It is kind of an exhaust dirty, so it cleans off pretty well. But let me show you some of the parts that are involved in this complete workover. Here are the parts that you're going to need to take care of this job. This is my old exhaust manifold. This is this stainless steel kind of formed sheet metal welded up one. I didn't have any cracks in it, which is great to see. Like I said, I did have a leak, and I'll show you what that looked like, as well as the wastegate noise. The two gaskets that I didn't anticipate needing, so it caused me a little trip to the store, were these two. So this ring is your gasket that sits against your primary exhaust pipe, or your downpipe on the flange of the exhaust manifold, and you can see that part number. And the second one is where that downpipe meets the rest of your exhaust system before the secondary cat. That's kind of a tri-lobe, and you can see that part number. That's a WCM, kind of an interesting Land Rover part number. You're also going to need the gasket that goes against the head and the exhaust manifold. It's a stamped cleared. It's like 3 sheets of sheet metal. Now here you can see I actually had a pretty significant exhaust leak that I didn't realize until you take this apart. Turns out these 3-4 studs were quite loose. I could almost loosen them by hand, which is a little scary. But the exhaust manifold is in decent shape, no cracks like I said, but this is the culprit here. So under boost, that's what you would hear, is this constant rattling around. And the new exhaust manifold, the cast manifold, fixed all the problems. I'm super happy with it, so let me show you how I did. Okay, like I said, I got a couple of simple parts removed, very easy to do. This is the strut tower crossbar, you can see on the bottom, the black thing, and the center intake tube, and very easily to pop off the engine cover. Over here, as the car is up unblocked, now the top of the engine's exposed, you can see the center pipe goes between these two things. I happen to have an open air intake. I just added that and zip tied it just the other day to see how she sounds. Highly recommend that if you guys want to do that, but that's a temporary thing. I'm just going to let that dangle. Next, we're going to take out the secondary intake tube. Pretty simple, just one little nut here. It's 12mm plastic thing, and then you got to rotate it out, and there's a clamp down the back. And I'll see if I can get a picture of that for you. This little plastic stud holds on to the top of the engine cover that pops right out, and this is just a friction hold here on the secondary pipe against that rubber grommet right there behind my thumb. Don't need to take this tube off right now. It's just going to sit on top of the stud, so you just give this a gentle push towards the back, and you can see pops right out of that clip there, that rubber clip. So now I got to get down there and get that hose clamp on the end. Alright, so now I'm under the car, passenger side wheel well. You can see there's your front shaft. Sorry to get the phone up here. I got plenty of access in this area to get that clamp off right there. I'm going to use a short, very small 1/4 inch drive, 7mm socket to loosen that and see if we can pop that off. Alright, I got that clamp nice and loose. Really hard to get your hand up here around this plastic shroud. Probably would be easy to remove that too, but I can just barely get my hand up here and loosen this tiny clamp here. So now that that's nice and loose, let's go pull it from the top. Alright, give that a little wiggle, and she's free. Now I just got to wiggle it out of there with 2 hands. We'll rotate forward, and she pops right out. Pretty sweet. Okay, secondary intake pipe's off. As you can see, the car is up on ramps, so it's easy to get underneath and on top. But because of the nice round front end of these things, a nice little step stool to help you get you up and get your knees on the radiator support. This will give us a nice look down. You can see the heat shield here. It's kind of silver. It's right underneath these lines. This is held on with 4 bolts. You can see one silver one right there. There's one on the opposite corner, and then 2, they're kind of rusted just in front of my finger. There's 2 right on top of each other here in the back. Those got to be removed and the heat shield will be done. Heat shield's loose now. Good opportunity to plug your turbo intake. You can see the top of it right there. I'm going to use a nice clean sock that I have in the garage. Should be a little bit difficult to get out. You got plenty of clearance over here behind those oil lines that go to your turbo, but they're nice and rigid over here in the corner, and that's where it's going to get nice and tight. So the good thing is it's flexible. You can kind of bend it a little bit. Hopefully I can get it. Got all 4 bolts out, even though the heads were rusty. No problems at all. They're not heavily torqued. All 10mm hex head bolts. One thing I want to just show everybody, this is a potential future failure. You see here your vacuum lines and pressure lines going through here. There's stainless steel. This top one on mine was actually making contact with this tube here. You can see there's a little corrosion, a little bit of wear between them. So I'm going to kind of wrap a rubber tube around that, zip tie it, heat shrink it, kind of like they did here, just to get that off that, because it could cause a future failure, and it's so hidden underneath all the intake tubes we don't even see it. Alright, got the heat shield out. Yes, like I thought, it was a little bit of a pain. As you can see, it's kind of bent upward, and this kind of tongue that hangs on the back, I bent there to get it up and out. Not a big deal. Like I said, they're flexible. You can bend it back in position. Really just, you know, make sure it hugs around the new manifold like it does here. As I took it out, this is a little bit of a concern. Obviously, you can see heat that's doing its job, but uh-oh. We've got soot, which means, unbeknownst to me, I might be suffering from the common flange weld failure, or at least maybe a gasket failure of this exhaust. Okay, looking down on top of the exhaust downpipe, that bolt right there, I loosened a little bit. Not as torqued down as you'd think. As long as it's not rusty and corroded, it should be easy to come out. That's got to come out on the opposite side of the downpipe flange. You will see this bolt, and there's one kind of underneath it there. Those are retaining bolts. You only have to loosen them a couple of times because the flange is slotted. So once this one in the front here is removed and those are loose, you can slide the pipe towards the back of the car, and it'll be free. Okay, so I got all 3 bolts off the downpipe flange, and it looks like only this one that was on the outside that I showed you before was the one with the slot. The other 2 look like they're just a solid hole, so they do completely have to come out. So difficulty is that bottom one that you can't really see, but you can reach underneath the downpipe and feel. That's going to be the hardest one to get off. So let me show you what I did. You can see I have 1/4 inch extension reaching over there, you know, towards the driver's side wheel well, and I got a wrench like this. It's happens to be a Craftsman 10mm. All these nuts are all these bolts are 10mm heads. So what's nice about this is you got a very minute movement in the ratchet, because you only got a couple of degrees that you can stick this wrench underneath, as you can kind of see it there, underneath the downpipe, and probably go only like 2 or 3 degrees at a time. But that's enough to get that bolt loose. And now we can see if we can loosen some of the exhaust and move that downpipe over to the side. Okay, here's a nice view from under the car that I could probably only get with my phone. So I guess now with the hex head out of the way, it reveals that that bottom one is a slot. So
thank goodness you only really have to rotate that thing maybe 5, 6, 7 rotations. You don't have to completely take it out. As you can see there, I dropped it sitting on top of the tranny. But that'll give you a slot to get this up and out of the way. But just make note of the orientation of the slots. So I would take the top 2 out, and then you can kind of slide this thing out to the bottom, or at least maybe help it with installation before you tighten things down. So, let me back the phone out here. I gotta give myself a little room in the exhaust. So here's the passenger side mount. As you can see, it's undone. The driver's side mount pulled off of its little peg. And going back further, here's the mid mount. I'm just gonna, see, mine's got a little pressure to the side because I have a hitch on this car, so I need a little adjustment. So I'm just gonna take those 2 bolts out, give myself some wiggle room. Now that I got that bolt out of the way, you can see once you take that strap bolt out of the way, the exhaust moves out of the way perfectly. Gives you plenty of room to work on the rest of the exhaust manifold. So next step is to unband the turbo. That's not going to be that easy because I've seen multiple pictures on the internet, and you can see the band clamp. It almost looks like a square O right there between the kind of rusty cartridge of the turbo and the exhaust manifold. There's a bolt 180 degrees opposite of that, and the good thing is on mine the nut of the bolt is facing down, so I should be able to reach from the bottom and undo that nut. I will definitely reorient that for potential future. I wish they put it a little bit more accessible on this side of the car because I can get to it. Alright, a little forward view of the car. I'm going to try to stick my phone up in this little spot so you can see how tight this is to get to that band of the turbo side. You can see the nut right there. So the good thing is I think I can reach it. Let's focus there. I think I can reach it with a little bit of an extension and maybe a universal joint. Let's give it a shot. Okay, I got the nut off from that very tight location using an extension and a spring-loaded universal joint. I'll show you in a minute. And then I just whacked the bottom of that joint of the band clamp. As you can see, it busted loose. So remove that and I'm good to go. Band clamp came off and not a problem. Once I smacked it a little bit to kind of bust it free and just rotate it out of the way. The good thing is it has that kind of pivot joint there, so it's good to go. The bolt is captured with a one-way washer, all stainless, so it's not going to crust all up and fall out on you. So now there's a little nut. This is the extension I was talking about. Quite nice. I had to pair up a couple of them. This is actually a 1/4-inch screwdriver extension, which comes in handy sometimes. But this was kind of key, having that spring-loaded universal joint, so it keeps this, you know, your 10mm socket almost perfectly coaxial, so you can get into that nut, and maintains it that way. Quick recap: we have removed the flange from the downpipe and those 3 bolts. We have removed the heat shield, obviously prior to that. I've disconnected the flange mounting to the exhaust manifold side of the turbo. So what's left is the 10 nuts that hold the exhaust manifold to the engine. I'll get my phone down in here. So these are a 13mm hex nut. Little loose, shouldn't round off. You could probably pound on a 1/2 inch if you're a little worried or yours is a little rusted. So I'll get attacking that. But here's a little something I want to show you before I get into it. These 2 on the end are completely loose by hand. So that soot that I saw on the inside of my heat shield was actually due to the flange not squeezing the gasket correctly. So a little scary, but at least not a weld failure like I anticipated. So let's take these nuts off. Back under the car again. I got all the nuts off of the exhaust manifold up top. Now, interestingly enough, more of the studs unthreaded than I expected, so I'll have to separate the nuts from the studs. I'll do that in a minute. So the last connection I have to the car is actually the wastegate actuator rod. You can see that actuator rod there. It's going horizontal across the screen. got a little tiny clip on it up top. It has to be pried off a little flathead screwdriver underneath that. Make sure it doesn't go doing and go flying. You can see how it's clipped on. So I'm going to pry that off and loosen the nut on the back side, and that will relieve my wastegate actuator arm. And we should see if this can come out. Clip is removed and the backside nut is also removed. So it's going to be a little bit difficult because sitting here not running, the wastegate is open. You can kind of see it right there, the little flapper valve. So that's almost all the way extended. You actually need to push back the actuator rod as if it was acting on vacuum back into the actuator in order to get that rod out. I'm going to try doing it with two hands from above. If not, I will pop out this little hose, which is your vacuum slash poo boost hose, and then use my little vacuum tool to create a vacuum and pull it back. Now technically the turbo is disconnected from the exhaust manifold, and there's really nothing holding the exhaust manifold in, except for the couple of studs that are still left that didn't unthread themselves, and the one on the top center. Now that one has a, according to a couple diagrams, has a bigger diameter, so that's kind of the alignment, you know, holding the manifold stud. And what I need to do is actually separate down here by the exhaust, by the turbo. I need to separate this right here and slide it to the driver's side, or the left of the car, because the exhaust fins of the exhaust turbine stick out about an inch or so. So I have plenty of clearance. Once I get my arm off of the downpipe, I'm going to strap that over to the side, and then I'm going to remove some of those studs, and hopefully that'll give me some clearance to slide it to the left side of the car and up and out. So these are the 4 studs that came out as I tried to loosen the nuts. Not a big deal, like I said, they're not heavily torqued into the head of the car. They do have Torx, which seems to be like a T40, maybe a T45. I'm not exactly sure. I could go to the store and try to get that inverted star socket, but I just dug around, and luckily a 1/4 inch hex socket fits very snug over those things. So I'm going to try to loosen the ones that are left in the head and hopefully not round them off. Okay, so I'm doing a little evaluation. All the studs are out, and like I said, I need to slide this thing over like 1.5 inches to clear the impeller of the exhaust side. That's a very delicate, kind of stressful maneuver. I'm not getting a lot of room when I can strap this exhaust out of the way, and I can't obviously directly pull it up. So I'm going to have to take these rusty bolts off. I was hoping to avoid, but that's the exhaust flange from the primary downpipe down to the secondary catalytic converter. There's 3 of those. Not too concerned if they break them. I could drill them out and put other bolts in there. So let's take that out. So I got all the nuts off. You end up using a 1/2 inch really long wrench I had. Give me some good leverage on it. 2 of them threaded off no problem. Yes, they are rusty, but they came off. One of them I tried to use a 13mm on. I rounded it right over, so once it was rounded over, even the 1/2 inch wouldn't do anything for it. So I ended up using these spiral nut extractors. I was able to pound it on just a bit, and you can see it really grabs on. Gives you a 19mm hex that you can grab with a socket or a long wrench. Works pretty well. I'll just have to replace that. So now I can move the primary downpipe out of the way. With those flange bolts removed, and I took this mount off here, I have to use a lashing strap just to hold it so the exhaust doesn't fall. Bungee cord, something like that would work. Piece of rope. You can see up here, sneak my phone in. Now the primary downpipe is away from the turbo quite a bit. I got plenty of room. It's back quite far and completely out of the way. And so here comes a delicate maneuver. The manifold is now slid over to the driver's side or left. The only thing you're not seeing is the gasket. I took that out from above. I got it resting on top of the transmission, kind of just sitting there, so you can see how much you actually have to move it over. Quite a bit. That top stud won't pull through the manifold. It's actually an alignment stud, and it's kind of, you know, the primary one you put in when you reinstall. I'll show you that when it's out of the car. But there's a cute little turbo. Now let's get this thing completely out. Okay, one more thing before I pull the exhaust manifold out. I noticed that I'm not going to have a lot of room because of the actuator arm. This, even though disconnected, has no room to slide out of the way because I didn't remove the oil lines. So because it's hitting that bracket, I'm not going to be able to slide it up and down, because you can see the heat shield bracket is going to completely catch that. So I already removed one bolt. As you can see on the actuator arm, it's just two little 10mm bolts. I'm going to remove the other one and get that out of the way. As I begin to squeeze this between the firewall and the engine, these little tiny lines we talked about before, those are going to have to move. So I pulled the little plastic brackets up and out. They're just zip tied to these, and they slide right up off of those two studs. You can see they're already removed. So I want to make note of that. Now these things can completely bend out of the way, and we can squeeze this manifold out. Ta-da! The exhaust manifold is out completely. It does fit through there. It is a tight squeeze. Oddly enough, you got a little bit more room if you go towards the driver's side. In the process, I did kind of poke and rip the, you know, that black felt that's against the firewall. Not a giant deal. I can repair that. That's something that actually was damaged in the car when I got it, so I wouldn't mind doing that anyway. Perfect opportunity now to reach down and take a look at your turbo while it's fully exposed. I'm kind of lucky. I have very little shaft play. Spins nice and freely. No hurt fins. So that's quite exciting to see. So let's go take a look at the two manifolds. One thing I forgot to mention as I was noticing, you know, the clearances and things I had to work with to get this out. What I did to give me a little more room right before I slid it off the turbo. This is a pretty tight fitting against the diameter on the cartridge, exhaust side cartridge of the turbo. So what I did is just take a little torch and heat around here, just to give me a little bit of thermal expansion, loosen it up just a touch, and that totally helped me wiggle it right out of the way. So that's a nice suggestion. It has to be done from under the car with a, you know, like a propane torch I did from the passenger side wheel well. Here are the two manifolds. This is the original, and this is the aftermarket, supposedly improved design. We'll find that out once I get it in, tightened down, and go see how much noise and boost I make. So two other things I wanted to show before I get back to installing. This is that alignment stud. As you can see, it's a smaller hole than the others. So the stud doesn't pass through from the backside. So that you got to keep in mind. This is the last stud you're going to remove before you kind of edge it off the turbo. You can unthread it completely from the head, leave it there. Just be mindful of it. You don't want it going flying around. And here you can see all the wastegate play I had. This thing is pretty loose. I got a lot of play in the shaft. What's a little interesting is you can see a little discoloration there. So that's kind of interesting. Looks like it's been heated. The actuator arm, really loose. And the flapper itself is actually quite loose. That wiggles quite a bit. And you can even see it wasn't sealing well. You can see the soot. You know, this side doesn't have any soot, but on the back side here, looks like it was just ever so slightly leaking. So, new one. Nice and tight. Now there's a little up and down play in the actuator arm. That's okay. I might tighten this up a little bit. This seems a little loose to me, so I might do a little peening on the bottom of there. You can see that's a little bit too much of a gap that I I don't think I like, so I'm going to try to fix that. But everything else is nice and tight. You know, this spins freely, which is alright. That's just a different design. Alright, cleaning up the new turbo. I did peen over the valve a little bit, the flapper. That's nice and tight. Still loose enough to spin and do its thing, but sits nice and flat, nice and tight. I also took the actuator arm and put a large diameter nut on the back side of it, put it in the vise to give it a little squeeze, so it kind of mushroomed that washer a little bit. Notice there's very little gap in there now, very little wiggle. Still free to move around, but a lot tighter. That should help future rattling. Okay, so some people are a little worried about going and getting that aftermarket manifold because it's not a stainless sheet metal welded thing. It's a casted heavier manifold. So I've got a hoist scale here. We're gonna do a comparison. Looks like the original is 12.7 pounds, and I'll go grab the other one. All right, now I got the newer cast redesigned manifold on my hoist scale, and we got 16.9 pounds. So yes, it is heavier by 4.2 pounds. Not a significant difference to prevent turbo failure and cracking. All right, all cleaned, and I got the new manifold stuffed in there. A little bit easier to move these lines out of the way and pass the primary exhaust flange down right through here, right next to this bleed off nipple. But as you can see, I got it down in there. No issues. It's kind of snug, hugging the turbo very gently in the diameter. I still got to get it on a little bit, probably 1/16, eighth of an inch or so. I got the primary stud almost all the way in. Gaskets in there as well, just to get things aligned so I don't hurt anything. I'm going to proceed to tighten that down and then get the other studs in place. Now I got all the studs tightened down way better than they were before, and only the center top is cinched down just enough, snug enough to hold everything. The rest have the washers and nuts in place, as you can see. So there is a certain tightening sequence I'll show you in the next segment. This is a torque down sequence for the original sheet metal exhaust manifold. So I would imagine that would probably be slightly more flexible than the cast one that I just installed, but I'm going to follow the same pattern. You can see you start with the bottom center, go up to the top, and then you kind of crisscross in an X pattern. So 4, 3, then 5, then 6, and then across to 7. So you kind of crisscross as you go from the center outward. Now keep in mind, this is facing the front of the engine as if you were standing behind the exhaust manifold. So you gotta kind of flip your mind and work from left to right. I guess it doesn't really matter too much, but as long as you do the crisscross pattern as I recommend here. Now this is 37 Newton meters. This is the suggested torque, which is about 28 foot-pounds or 328 inch-pounds. So I'm going to torque those to that. With the help of my wife, you can see how uncomfortable this is to work on the exhaust manifold. I have a pad here over the radiator support, and I've been using this as an arm and neck support as I reach down behind the engine. This is your position as you do this entire job. Thank you, sweetie. Well, as I start torquing this, I started to realize probably a good opportunity to reach down there, probably with your left hand, and get into the flange area there and reach back and see if you can touch the exhaust side impeller. Make sure it's spinning freely and not binding. And I did that right now, even though I do still have a small gap, probably a 1/16 or 3/32 of an inch. But spins freely so far. I'm going to keep an eye on that as I tighten things up, just to make sure I don't hurt anything. Well, before I continue torquing this down, I still have some freedom in the movement of both of these components. I think I'm going to do what I did before to get the exhaust manifold off. I'm going to heat up just, you know, the lower bell housing behind that line you see there. Just heat that up a little bit with a torch, use a little bit of advantage of thermal expansion just to close that gap, and make sure that's all tightened up before I actually torque the whole thing down. Okay, I'm still under the car, have not torqued the exhaust manifold down yet. Figured it's a good opportunity while both things are wiggling enough that I can get that band clamp between the turbo. I did reorient it so I can get to the nut from the top, and I'm going to use a little, you know, like sticky butyl rubber on the socket so I don't lose the nut. Make sure I get that stuff off before I start the car and get it hot. But kind of a pain to wiggle this thing on. What's nice in this orientation, you can reach up there with a pair of pliers and give that end right where the bolt is a little pinch, like right there, right where the tip of my finger is, and then that gives you plenty of the stud of the bolt sticking out and you get the nut on. This is a way better orientation to have that band clamp. As you can see, I can get to the nut pretty easily. Got about a half of an inch of the bolt sticking out. What's nice is it's not going to interfere with the heat shield mounting. You can see that's right here in front of my finger, and that flat surface there, and it's completely out of the way of the lines and also the actuator. So we're good to go torquing. Just a little note here, as I started to torque it, I realized a nice 1/2 inch wobble end socket on my 13mm. As you can see there, because it is kind of like a 10-degree angle downward. So just enough room to get your torque wrench on all these things. You're probably going to need a wobble socket. Everything is now torqued down. The wobble socket or wobble adapter worked really well. So now I'm installing the actuator arm, wiggling it around all the lines. There's two 10mm bolts I got to put back in. They're just sitting there loose. I got to install the actuator rod first into the wastegate flapper arm, and then I'll get the nut on the back side of that and put that upper clip on. Wastegate actuator is torqued down with the two 10mm hex bolts, and the rod is in position and tightened down. Just using two 10mm wrenches, kind of easy, around the flapper hole there, and then this clip is pushed down from the top nice and tight against the top of the flapper arm mount. Now I was pushing about 15 pounds of boost. I have a boost gauge inside, so I can tell if I'm over boosting or under boosting, so that'll help me adjust this. I might double check it and put a vacuum on the actuator so it draws back. Right now it's in the open position, as you can see. I can reach down and touch the flapper. So if you put a little vacuum on that and see how it seals, that might help before you put the downpipe on.
The downpipe is going to get a new gasket. This is a consumable. You can see how squished and compressed it is. The surface isn't that great. The new one is much thicker to go in the new groove. You can see, compare the two here. It's a bit thicker, ready to be compressed into that seal. This goes between the new exhaust manifold and the flange and the downpipe before you put those 3 bolts in.
Figured this is a good opportunity to shove my phone down here and see if I can get a good shot of looking into the manifold with the gasket installed. Can't at all see what I'm doing, but there you can see things a little more clear before we cap it all up. Back under the car now, you can see I put the lower bolt in probably about halfway. That's going to give me a little landing point for the slot that you can see right in front of the screen there to help me kind of set this thing in place, and then I can get the other 2 bolts in. Just got to be careful I don't hurt that gasket. This is a flat face on the exhaust flange, and there is a little bit of a boss sticking out of the exhaust, so that's going to go in it. Alright, let's see if I can wiggle this in place. Downpipe is now resting, slotted on that bottom or lower bolt. I'm going to go get the other two. Wish I had them on me right now. But underneath the car is a nice easy way to grab the opposite side of the downpipe and kind of rotate it in position while the other hand tightens some of these screws down. So let's go get that done. I was able to get all the downpipe bolts nice and torqued. If you remember when I took it off, that bottom one, I had an extension going underneath it almost straight out to the driver's side wheel well. That was a nice way to get some good torque on it with a wrench. I started with a 1/4 inch just because it's skinnier, you can maneuver it a little bit. But I think my extension is like 1.5 feet, 3/8 drive, and I had a flex neck ratchet, and you're only able to get a couple clicks out of it, enough to get it rotated, but everything's nice and tight. All the flanges are seated. And now I got to connect the opposite end. Back under the car, I've got the downpipe sitting right there. It still has a little bit of flex into it because it is a flexible coupling in front near the catalytic converter. I think it's actually behind it. This is a secondary catalytic converter. You can see I have the rest of the exhaust strapped to that crossbar, like I showed you when I took this apart. This is going to get a new gasket. The one in there is pretty squished, so I can give you a part number of that in a minute. But that's going to get another gasket sitting right down there. Good opportunity to blow out anything you see in the catalytic converter face there. I did get a couple of new nuts. If you remember, the other ones were really hard coming off. These are just stuff I had sitting around from actually taking apart a Volkswagen Passat. They're lock nuts, but they're the pinch style. What you're really looking for is the wide flange on the bottom. So I have a couple of these. I'm just going to replace them all. The studs look okay, so it should be okay. Cinching this down. Before I put this on, I did want to point out this gasket does have an orientation. It doesn't seem like it would need to be, but it looks pretty symmetric. You can see this tiny little notch on one side, and there's another one in a different location over here. You can see the secondary catalytic converter actually has matching notches. Let's see, you can see it right there and a little bit right there. So just match the gasket up with that before you put it onto the downpipe. Okay, gasket's in place. It looks like those notches are on opposite sides of one of the triangle sides. I didn't even notice it's right here and here on the gasket, so it doesn't seem to matter much. You know, I noticed the orientation of it. The hole is way bigger than the hole in the flange, so not a problem. I did want to make note that I don't have the exhaust mounts on yet, and that bracket that we took apart way earlier that wraps around the primary catalytic converter, that's also not tightened down. That'll give you a lot more pipe flexibility to get this connection together. Okay, that flange is really nice and tight. It's kind of satisfying, just like the other flange gasket. You can actually hear the gasket squishing in there, so you know you're getting a nice seal. I did round off two of the nuts a little bit. Not too concerned. They're probably going to rust and go crazy anyway. Next step, I'm going to push these rubber mounts on. They are a little bit of a pain in the butt. I did learn a trick way back. If you get a little WD on the shaft or inside the hole a little bit, kind of helps it squeeze it on, and then that'll just dry out and go away. Or get it wet with soapy water. So we'll cinch those on and go do the other strap. Rubber mounts are on. Wanted to make a little note here. During the whole process here, you got to watch out for your O2 sensors and their wires. So now that we're done, I'm going to just make sure that these wires are routed correctly. This one's a little hanging down. I got to push it back. And this one over here on the passenger side did fall out of its clip, so you can get these all nice and tight where they're supposed to be. And I gotta mount my mid rubber mount back in there with two 10 miller hex head bolts. The band clamp that goes around the catalytic converter is completely loose from before, so you can wiggle that into position and rotate it down onto its seating surface. And we got one 10mm hex head bolt to put through there, and that will be tight. With that strap now in place and tightened down, this actually concludes all the things needed for the exhaust. Manifold's in, downpipe's in, connection to the rest of the exhaust is in, actuator's in, and everything's mounted to the car. So final pieces are heat shield's got to go back on now that everything's exposed, and then the intake pipe. Got my heat shield kind of pushed into place. The tight spots I'm going to have are getting this bottom lip around the exhaust manifold, and this one over here on the driver's side is going to be the hardest. That's the one that gave me a problem on the way out, and I got to keep in mind that that tongue down the bottom was bent essentially backward in the vehicle, so make sure I get that all in position. All right, let's stuff it in. Heat shield is pushed down. Wasn't really a big deal to get the passenger side over. A little bit of a tight fit over here on the driver's side. The issue is now I got to get that lower lip that I showed you around that last stud. You can see it's kind of interfering. I'll have to do a little bit bending, manipulating, but this should go pretty easy. Get back under the car. I want to take a look at the heat shield because I was having a little problem getting those holes aligned, and I'm glad I got down here because, you know, I did say this is flexible and it bends a little bit, but because of the way I bent it, my actuator arm would not travel backwards. If you remember installing this, this is now in the open position, so I would actually have had a problem here if I didn't come down and look. So that, as you can see, that area is pretty dented in. I'm going to have to take this out and bend that back into position so that that arm can travel freely back and forth. The other side seems fine, but that side's going to be an issue. Back under the car, you can see I'm wrenching those last two bolts of the heat shield. It's got plenty of clearance now away from everything, and it is pretty pliable, so if you are concerned, you can get a screwdriver up in there and bend things out of the way. I got plenty of clearance now for my actuator arm, as you can see. It's also a nice view to, you know, reassure you that even if I have some boost problems, you know, I gotta adjust that wastegate actuator. There is room, plenty of room right there to go under the car and get to it with a set of 10mm wrenches and pop that clip off and, you know, go forward or back. All right, I'm going to finish tightening this down. Heat shield's now torqued in place and plenty of clearances around things up from the top view, as you can see. I did remove my sock that's in the turbo intake, and everything's clean and blown out from that. And intake pipe looks pretty clean. So I did have thoughts of rotating this clamp around so I can actually get it more from the, you know, looking forward or say back from the vehicle, but they've got this little stop there to prevent it from rotating, so I think I'm just going to leave it as is and get it from the passenger wheel well. Intake tube is now tightened down to the band clamp to the intake of the turbo. This is that stud that has a little plastic knob to hold the engine cover. That goes down onto a rubber grommet. It's got a spacer in it so you can torque it decently, but don't go crazy. And the other one just kind of floats in there. Alright, one thing I forgot to do, but I still can access it, is put these lines back in position. And there's a little stud clamp right there. I still have those, so I'm just gonna have to rebuild them with some zip ties and make sure none of these guys wiggle. There's one there, and then there's one right on the other side of this. Probably easier to do ahead of putting the pipe in. These are those little clips that push down onto those studs sticking out of the valve cover. Those are just zip ties. This is actually like the mating ratchet side of a zip tie, so you can push that right through and use your own zip ties. And I would check that one line that I had that was rubbing. You can see I had a little piece of rubber there so it stays off the other lines, and I'll get those all nice and tight. I would have done this before putting that main pipe on, so if you see this part of the video, definitely do this ahead of time. Those lines are all zip tied nice and tight now.
this is a good opportunity before you start putting things completely back together. Remember, got a line to go between those two hose barbs on the intake pipe and one there on the valve cover. I do notice a couple of, I guess, remnants of road travel, or who knows, just little bits of earthy goods. I'm gonna get those out of the engine, vacuum them, blow them out. It's also a good point to mention that you've been kind of kneeling down on this all day. So take a look and make sure you haven't bent any lines and nothing's rubbing each other. I did notice a line back here was a little too close for comfort, so I kind of pushed that out of the way. I didn't hurt any other connectors. Just a good thing to check before you actually put the last of the intake pipes on, which covers most of this, and then obviously the engine cover. Primary intake tube pipe is on. I got the little vacuum hose in the back here. That goes to the valve cover. That's on at both ends. The small end goes to the driver's side. Bigger end goes on the passenger side. I did notice, just as I thought, you keep an eye on these little fittings and lines. These two are actually rubbing pretty well together. You can see that's kind of worn out there on that stainless vacuum line, and right into the bottom of this elbow, which is another vacuum line of the intake tube. I'm just going to take a zip tie and kind of cinch these over to that stud to get them away from that plastic line. A little vibration over time that could cause a leak and be really hard to diagnose. Primary intake tube is on. My temporary suspended here mass airflow sensor open air intake is in place. Now I'm putting the strut tower tie bar in position. That has 2 bolts and 1 clamp. Now if you didn't notice taking this off, the passenger side has just nice straight alignment holes, and the driver's side is what has your slots. So just keep that in mind. You want to start by tightening the passenger side first. Engine bay is all buttoned up, everything's tightened, and we're good to go. I'm going to start it, let it idle for a little bit, let things heat up. My guess is the exhaust manifold will smoke a little bit. I did spray it down with brake parts cleaner ahead of time to get most of the storage oil off, but it's probably going to smoke a little bit because of that. I pulled the car outside a little bit. It's going to probably be hard to see, but there is a significant stinky smoke coming off of that. That's totally expected. And we got new gaskets and new exhaust manifold, disturbed some things. So I'm letting the car idle, gave it a couple little revs. I don't hear any binding, I hear no exhaust leaks. So I'll let that heat up to engine running temperature and go for a drive. Engine's almost up to temperature. Let's see if I can give it a couple revs, get things heated. I can hear what that open air intake sounds like. You can actually hear the turbo whistle and a little blow off. It's kind of nice. Okay, engine is up to temperature. We're gonna go take a quick drive, give it some boost, see how it behaves. Got a boost gauge right in front of you. Okay, I had to turn around. This thing's going so fast. So it seems like I got no difference in turbo behavior. Well, kind of a side benefit, it looks like I'm almost pushing 20 psi, which is quite a nice pickup. There's very little turbo lag, probably identical to what I had before. I'm super impressed. I'm super happy. So project well done. Thanks for watching. Hopefully this helped you with your project, replacing your Evoque exhaust manifold.